I wanted you all to know a story that I told earlier today, and about being in the Higher Education Policy Institute with the University of Alabama and Mississippi State a couple of years ago. And the culmination of that year-long program was to go to D.C. and advocate for summer Pell Grant. And as you know, that happened this past summer, but Dr. Colgross and I went to Congressman's office and gave our sales pitch. And as I said, I think he already knew all about what we were telling him, but he listened to us patiently. And when we finished, he said, well, that's obvious that summer Pell needs support. We need to do that. And so I don't need to tell you the importance of summer Pell because you all are aware of that. So I want you to know that Congressman Brooks has supported summer Pell, and he supports our community college students, and so we'll leave it at that.
All right. Well,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate you being here today.
Do you want to say anything? We've got a TV celebrity here, Wayman Burke. Every Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, Guerrilla Politics. If you want to see a nice little tangle between a duo of Wayman Burke and Dale Jackson, I tape record every one of them and watch every one. I really do. If you ran as a candidate opposite me, there might be a few things I'd pull out. Much like you do, or would with me. I'm sure I'd give you enough ammo. I appreciate y'all being here today. Most of this time that we're going to spend together on whatever questions y'all may have or comments you may have about anything that's related to public policy. Okay, what's going on in Washington, things you want to communicate to me here that you want me to take back to Washington. So most of the time is going to be reserved for that. There are lots of issues, and there are so many issues that I don't know which ones y'all want to focus on. So that's why I'm going to have plenty of time for the Q&A. I'm going to focus on just one issue. I'm not even going to talk about this debt and deficit chart that y'all have, just make sure y'all are aware of it. My focus is primarily going to be on our economy. Historically, in the United States of America, if you go back over the last 60 to 70 years, GDP annual growth has averaged about 3.3, 3.2%. That's the historical average over 60, 70 years. Now, granted, a lot of that is post-World War II, when we were about the only game in town. Much of Europe had been destroyed with their industrial capacity. The same thing could be said of Japan and Southeast Asia and China. So you would expect under those circumstances that with our industrial capacity having been unaffected with the bombings and the destruction, that we would be a world leader and our economy would grow rapidly after World War II. And that helps explain a little bit the 3.3% average GDP growth. But still, that continued into the 60s and into the 70s, into the 80s and into the 90s. Over the last 10 or 15 years, though, we've been in somewhat of an economic doldrums. We had a recession in 2008, a recession being a contraction of the economy. Those are always really bad things you want to avoid. And then slowly but surely we've come out of the recession, but still it's been the most anemic recovery from a recession in the economic history of the United States of America. Not once did we have a 3% GDP growth rate over the last decade in real dollar terms. So we're trying to do things to jump us back up to our historical norm of 3.3% or better. So far this year, we're in pretty good shape. I don't know if it will continue. You have economic cycles, long term, but within that long term, you have ups and downs as you move into the future. And so we'll see if what we're doing right now will be able to persevere. But there are some things that we have done in Washington that have helped bring this about. The most important thing is to make our American industries more competitive. We're in a real tough international marketplace, an international competition level that we didn't have in the 50s or for much of the 60s. Really, it wasn't until the 70s and the 80s that you started seeing the rest of the world catch up industrially from the damage that was done from World War II. By way of example of how well we have done over the past year, Unemployment rate has dropped significantly down to 3.9%. Perhaps most importantly, there are some demographics that have done very, very well. This is the August jobs report, year over year, August 2017 to August 2018. The demographics are such that with our African American community, their unemployment rate dropped 1.4 percentage points. They did the best in the United States of America in terms of improvement over where they were. The Asian American community did second best at 0.9 percentage point improvement. And then Caucasian Americans and Hispanic Americans improved by 0.4 percentage points. But that's an example of how we have improved. Perhaps on a better scale, we had a 2.9% increase in income, wages earned for Americans. It's one thing to have GDP growth, but if your family's income is not improving, then it really doesn't help you as much as you would like, even though the country may be getting stronger. That 2.9% 2.9% earned income growth rate, that's a big deal. We've got, as you would expect, some sectors of society that are doing better than 2.9% and some worse, but nonetheless, overall, that's very important. The chances that we took, and there are chances that you always have to take as you try to explore with different policies which ones are the best ones, are based on history, and they're based on the international competition that we have. If we're going to have a strong manufacturing and industrial base, what do you got to do? You got to decrease the cost of doing business in the United States of America. To the extent our prices are higher because of federal government burdens placed on our industries, that gives our foreign competitors a competitive advantage. By way of example, I'm not sure if you're familiar with our trade deficit. It's around at $550 billion a year. That's how much is hemorrhaging from the United States to the rest of the world, taken from our economies. If you're familiar, do we have anyone with an economics background familiar with the multiplier factor? Like a new company comes into an area and they might have $10 million in wages. And you would think, okay, well, that's the economic stimulus, $10 million from the wages that they're going to be paying. But really, you've got a cascading or multiplier effect so that that money is circulated in the community, and it might be a 5-to-1 ratio. So even though it's only $10 million in wages, it might have a $50 million economic impact overall to a community. Well, the same thing applies when you have $550 billion being taken from your economy. You not only lose that $550 billion in wealth, but you also have an inverse multiplier effect that hurts us. China being the biggest competitor that we have to worry about, our deficit with them is in the neighborhood of $375 billion. Now, I won't go into all the unfair trade practices related to China, but suffice it to say that they're taking a huge advantage of us, and we're hemorrhaging just to China in goods and services $375 billion a year. So how do we make American industries more competitive so that we can have the jobs that we want with the pay that we want? You have to decrease some of the federal government burdens, and there's always a political risk with that. You've got regulatory burdens where the federal government is saying you've got to do this or else. You know, there'll be some kind of punishment. Now, most of those burdens, they have a good side to them. They might be environmental. They might be worker safety. There might be any number of reasons that come into play for why those burdens are being forced upon our businesses and our industries. But you have to weigh those versus the economic cost of imposing these burdens, where it's one thing to have a safe work environment, by way of example, but if you have no workers there because the plant is closed down, is that really the trade-off that you want to make? It's a perfectly safe work environment if there are no workers there. So what we have tried to do is decrease the regulatory burdens. We did that legislatively in Congress with some of the reversals of the burdens that were in place, and the executive branch, they've also done some of those things, okay? Hoping to decrease the cost of doing business in America so that we'd be more competitive and would have more jobs for ourselves and our young people. Second thing that we did, as always, these things are two-edged swords, this one is too, are the tax cuts. Now, the tax cuts historically, you look back at Democrat President John F. Kennedy and Republican President Ronald Reagan, and they both had tax cuts. And the purpose of those tax cuts was to stimulate the economy. Now, in the 1960s, the tax cuts focused more on individual citizens, okay? And by focusing on individual citizens, it had a good positive stimulative effect, because remember, in the 1960s, We were the industry of the world to a very large degree. The rest of the world was still playing catch up in the early 60s from the damage and destruction that had been done by World War II. So in the 1960s, with that plan, that worked out pretty well and stimulated the economy, and we had pretty good economic growth in the first part of the 1960s as a result of the strategy employed by Democrat President John F. Kennedy. Then in the 1980s, you had Ronald Reagan. He employed a similar strategy of tax cuts, okay? 1980s, it still had the desired effect, perhaps not as much dollar per dollar as you had in the 1960s with JFK, because by the 1980s, you had more international competition. And perhaps in the 1980s, we should have focused more on the cost of doing business side of the taxes than we did. But nonetheless, even with what was done by President Reagan, we enjoyed basically a quarter of a century of economic growth. You had one blip in the 1990s. Unfortunately for George Bush the first, it was 2 quarters right before his election, probably cost him the election. But outside of that recessionary period, we had basically 25 years of economic growth, good growth, particularly in the 1990s under President Bill Clinton when he was President of the United States. We were well above the 3.3% average over that 60 or 70 year period. So we had that as a backdrop. And so what we did this past December is we said, well, we're going to try to emulate what John F. Kennedy did, what Ronald Reagan did, and we did tax cuts. Now, to a certain degree, we diverged a little bit from their strategies. We recognized that because of very stiff international competition, we've got to do something to make it where our companies can be more competitive. It doesn't do any good if we give our citizens more money and they go to Walmart and they buy Chinese products. That doesn't produce American jobs. And ultimately, our people, if they don't have jobs, they don't have the income. So it doesn't make any difference what the tax rates are if they don't have the jobs that produce the income. And so we split the tax deductions, tax breaks, tax cuts, whatever you want to call them, between the consumer side of the equation, which would be the American citizenry, and then also corporate America, the job creators, the industries, the companies. And let me be clear about something over here. We knew that when we engaged in this strategy that we were going to take some political hits, okay, because it's easy to demagogue on this issue. It's easy to say, oh, you're just favoring the rich, okay? And that's the argument that is always raised in politics anytime you have tax cuts of the nature that we propose. Let's be clear about corporate taxes, okay? Corporate taxes at the time in the United States of America, we were the worst or second worst on the planet in terms of how much of a tax burden we had on our corporations. But more importantly, what's lost in all this is that corporations are what? They're really people, okay? They're a group of people who have come together, they've purchased stock, they have an ownership interest, and they create this business, but ultimately it's people. And so with every profit that is earned by a corporation, you have double taxation. You have income taxation at the time that the money is earned by the corporation, and then what happens with that money? It's either reinvested in the corporation or it's given to the owners, people, American citizens. If it's given in terms, back to the company in terms of investment, well, that's a good thing because you're creating jobs. It's also a good thing because the people who own that stock, it tends to go up in value when they sell it. What do they have to do? If they make a profit, they have to pay a second layer of taxes. In this instance, capital gains. If, on the other hand, the people who own the corporation decide to immediately distribute those profits to the people, then what is it? It's a dividend, and then it's subject to income taxes, where it's taxed a second time at the income tax rates, one for corporation, one for people. So that's the economics and political side of all this, of that gamble in December of 2017. Now, what's been the result? The first quarter of this year, we were at 2.2% GDP growth rate. Last quarter, we were at 4.2% GDP growth rate. You add those two together, what have you got? 3.2% average. That's something we haven't enjoyed as a country in a decade. So that's the strategy behind what we're trying to do, even though we know we're going to have political hits, as you always do in a political environment. That's the nature of the beast. The job of the minority is to become the majority. And it doesn't make any difference if the Republican or Democrat, if they're in the minority, their job is to become the majority. And so they will use whatever tools they are handed, whatever weapons they are handed, in order to try to advance their minority status to majority status. Now, the Federal Reserve in Atlanta has projected for this quarter, the third quarter, that we're looking at a 4.6, 4.7 percentage point GDP growth rate. If we have 2.2, then 4.2, then 4.7, it looks like we will break this decade-long cycle, going back to the George Bush administration, of not being able to enjoy a 3% GDP growth rate, which helps all of us. Now, in the Tennessee Valley, we've benefited not only from the national policy, but we're doing much, much better than the country as a whole. Over the last 6, 7 years, who have we had? We've had Toyota expand their plant, their engine production plant. We've had Bocar come here. We've had Polaris come here. We've had Remington come here. Aerospace, whether it be defense or NASA, they've been exploding with new jobs. We've got Toyota Mazda that's locating not far from Calhoun's main campus. That's going to produce 4,000 jobs. Today, after this event, I'm going to be interviewed by CNBC, and they're wondering, well, how come you guys are doing so much better than everybody else? That's a nice situation to have. Now, the heart of the district, Limestone, of the Tennessee Valley, Limestone, Morgan, and Madison counties, they've been exploding. A big problem that we face is traffic congestion because we're bringing in so many jobs. And that's something we're going to have to work with, particularly at the state level. The extremes of the district, the east and west ends, have not been doing as well as the heart of the Tennessee Valley. But let me talk to you just for a moment about Jackson County. Jackson County has had a new Google plant come in. Now, the Google plant is huge. The number of jobs, not so much. It's 100 and something jobs. They'll be good paying jobs. But just getting Google to move into Bridgeport and Stevenson area of Jackson County helps with industrial recruitment because it's good enough for Google. That's a good argument to advance. One thing that we're trying to do is with Bellefonte Nuclear Power Plant, if we can get that one going. This is a University of Alabama Economics Department study. This is what the end result's going to be. It's going to be over 1,000 jobs for the operation cycle of the plant, averaging $136,000 per job. Think about that. Over 1,000 jobs in little Hollywood, Jackson County, just outside of Scottsboro, with an average salary or wage scale of $136,000. You can imagine the kind of shot in the arm that is for a community like Jackson County, with DeKalb being close by and Marshall being close by. On the western side of the district, probably the county that has struggled the most is Lawrence County because the closing of the paper mill, they're still trying to recover from that loss. The Quad Cities, they have slow but steady growth. So they're not recessionary like Lawrence County was. They're growing, not as fast as the heart of the district, but overall the Tennessee Valley is doing great. That's not only because of the national policies that we're implementing, but it's also because of the quality of people that we have here, in large part because of folks like y'all producing the workforce that these folks need in order to do the things that they want done to stay in business and be profitable. So that's my report on what's happening in Washington and also nationally. I limited it just to one issue. I know there are hundreds of thousands of issues. At this point in time, it's all y'all's. Whatever subject you want to bring up, don't be shy. Probably not a question you can ask that is ornery as some that I get from my friends in the news media. Wayman, first question, go for it.
Now this is going to be an issue whether it's Democrats, Republicans, liberals, or conservatives, and that is...
The right answer is the pragmatic approach. If you've ever seen him on TV, that's his response. Go ahead, Wayman.
And that is Social Security and Medicare, for example. Both of them are running out of money. And of course, our deficits are increasing each year, which adds to the deficit, of course. How do you deal with that down the road of ensuring Social Security and Medicare?
Well, it's real simple. You have two choices. You can either increase the tax rates. Right now, individual citizens pay 6.2% if they're an employee, with the employer matching another 6.2%. And then if you're self-employed, your tax rate is 12.4%. So I'm sure there'll be some people who advocate raising taxes. There'll be others who advocate, and this is where I am, raising the age, somehow or another reducing the cost of Social Security and Medicare. And for me, everybody who's already got it, great. They get it exactly like it is, no changes whatsoever. People who are about to retire and be 65, and they're relying on that as with their financial planning over the decades, fine. No change to them either. But younger folks, or people in their 50s, anywhere from 20s to 50s, my suggestion is that over a period of time, you slowly but surely raise the age at which you're entitled to receive Social Security and Medicare benefits, and those people can plan accordingly. Let's face it, when Social Security and Medicare were first put into place, our lifespan was a lot less than it is now. So we have people who are living in this retirement age longer and longer and longer and longer. And the question then becomes, okay, are we going to continue to have this huge window in which people can retire, or is it wiser to raise the age a little bit to reflect the longer lifespan, or do we raise taxes on our youth, primarily people who have kids who are struggling to make ends meet? Is it better to raise taxes on them? And I personally prefer raising the age a little bit, even though it might mean folks like myself have to work a little bit longer. And there ought to be a phase-in period. Like for every year, there's an additional week or an additional month that you have to work until you get to whatever age it is that you think is appropriate and is keeping in accord with the longer lifespans that we're enjoying in America. But that's going to be a battle people are going to have to resolve because we are running out of money.
Are you opposed to privatization of Social Security?
Well, I don't know of any plan to privatize Social Security.
President Bush had talked
I don't know the details of that. I'm comfortable with the plan that we have in place now. So, you know, if someone wants to privatize it, certainly I'd be willing to consider it. But I've not heard or seen of any legislation to privatize it, so I'm not sure what that means. What do you understand privatizing to mean?
Basically, the government would get out of it and it would be sort of like an insurance policy.
I'm much more comfortable with Social Security and Medicare as we have it. Another question.
What about raising the cap? Would that do any good? You know, it's capped at 125,000.
Well, that is one of the things that can be argued. Your payroll tax, your cap on that 6.2%, I forget what the exact dollar figure is, but once you reach 100, 110, or 120,000, whatever that number is, then everything earned above that is not subject to the 6.2% if you're an employee, 12.4% if you're self-employed. There will be some arguments to raise the cap. I don't know how that's going to play out long term. I'm willing to consider it, but we also have to bear in mind that the people who are most likely to be impacted by that are the ones who are also most likely to create jobs. And so to the extent you reduce their capital, that means they have less money in which to invest in businesses that in turn create jobs for the people who are the employees. I mean, that's just the economic nature of it. So there's always a trade-off. There's never a free ride for anything that involves money. You have to look at the pros and you have to look at the cons and make a decision. That's what households have to do on a regular basis. The federal government seems to be exempt from that so long as we continue to borrow money, but at some point our borrowing capacity is going to be reached and we're going to be in an insolvency and bankruptcy situation, which quite frankly is not a good thing for a country to go through. Yes, ma'am.
Can you give us an update on the Affordable Care Act?
Well, the Affordable Care Act is probably going to continue as is for an indefinite period of time. The American people are split on it. There are some people who want to keep it as it is. Large number of people in that category. There are an equally large number of people in the opposite category who are working and they're seeing their premiums go through the roof, which in turn is adversely affecting their ability to take care of their families. I don't know about y'all. Y'all, I imagine, get your health insurance through the state of Alabama. My premiums have gone up over $12,000 over the last 3 or 4 years for health insurance. I'm subject to Obamacare and I'm forced to buy my insurance now through the Washington, D.C. Obamacare exchange. Again, there's no free ride. If you're going to give free health care to people, somebody else has to pay for it. And right now, I'm one of the people who has to pay about $12,000 more and there are lots of others, particularly in the private sector, who are having to pay a lot more, which in turn is reducing their ability to take care of their families. Then you've got another group, there's a third group out there that wants to have Medicare for all or single payer, whatever you want to call it, or the next step after that is fully socialized medicine like they have in the United Kingdom. Well, just to do Medicare for all or the single payer system, according to a George Mason University study, will cost $3.2 trillion per year in order to pay for it. And again, there's no free ride. Somebody has to pay for it. To put that $3.2 trillion in perspective, the entire spending of all the federal government on everything right now is a little over $4 trillion. So it's almost a doubling of the federal government costs. Now, if, to give you an idea of how much in taxes would have to be paid, if you were to use the payroll tax system we have now for Social Security and Medicare, and they call it Medicare for all, so that kind of puts it in that category. They don't have to come up with this tax structure. They could come up with another one. But if you're going to do it through the current payroll tax system, it would be a tripling of the payroll tax. Right now, all these payroll taxes generate about 1.6 trillion, give or take some. And so what would a tripling mean? Well, instead of coming out of your paycheck 6.2%, it's now 18.6, okay? And the employer match, instead of being 6.2%, would be 18.6, which reduces our competitiveness in a very tough international marketplace and would put some of our employers out of business because they're no longer able to make a profit. If you're self-employed, 37.2% would be what you have taken right off the top of your paycheck. Now here's a real kicker, okay? Let's say you had $100,000, just to throw that out as a number. If you're tripling the payroll tax deduction, now you're seeing the first $37,200 of your paycheck taken for this Medicare for all or single payer system, okay? You have to pay income tax on that $37,200 that they took from you, that you never get. That's still counted as taxable income under our current income tax law. So I don't know how you're going to work your way through that one. So yeah, we can have this system, but understand that there's a huge price tag with it, and then you get into a debate as to whether the current healthcare system we have now provides better healthcare, higher quality, versus what you'd get in a government-run healthcare system. The United Kingdom, I'll pick on them for a moment. Their socialized medicine is really good on routine things, but on life-saving things, their standards are unacceptable by what we're accustomed to in the United States of America. Way too often in the UK, they tell you to go get your affairs in order, even though there is a medical treatment that could cure you. But if the cost is high, then the bean counters say, no, we're not going to do it. You're just going to die. Okay? Y'all may have heard of the Independent Payment Advisory Board under Obamacare that Sarah Palin nicknamed the death panel. Well, that's what the Independent Payment Advisory Board's job is. You have limited money. We don't have a panacea. We don't have money for everything. You have limited money, and someone has to make a decision on which things we're going to treat and which we're not going to treat. And the ones we're not going to treat, those citizens are just going to either live with that illness or infirmity, or they're going to die from it. And that's why she nicknamed it the death panel. Okay, it's a very tough bean counter type decision that has to be made, and they do it in the UK regularly. And there are just a lot of people who are told to get your affairs in order. Your time has come, even though there are treatments out there, but they're expensive. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
So you implied that the people that are against the Affordable Care Act are the non-workers?
No.
Do you have...
The people who are opposed to the Affordable Care Act tend to be the people who are working,
No, the ones that
who
want
have
it.
jobs.
The ones that want it. What are the statistics on that? I don't know.
Oh, I don't have any polling data, but the people who complain to me the most about it are people who are working for a living, who have their own health insurance and are now having to pay much, much, much higher health insurance premiums because they're not only having to pay for their own health care, they're having to pay for someone else's health care who's not working for a living on the one hand, or on the other hand has a particular infirmity that is extremely expensive. And so these people are complaining about the health insurance premiums skyrocketing on them, and they have skyrocketed.
Mine's gone up too. I'm just wondering about the percentage.
Are you through the state of Alabama system?
No.
No, do you have private?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just wondering about, these days, how many people work full-time and yet can't, or even work part-time and can't, or don't have employer, don't have access to insurance.
I don't know the answer to that just off the
I'd be
cuff.
very
I'm sure there are studies out there. I can give you a general impression, but I don't know the exact numbers. Okay, any other questions or comments? Well, thank you so much for what you're doing. Please get your students graduated as soon as possible because there's a job waiting for them. Thank you.